So this video, I want to talk about another aspect of social structure, and that's the idea of social class or social stratification. So a different way of grouping, if we saw the last video, grouping ourselves in society. So again, thinking back about the sort of core case study we're examining of ourselves, our United States culture, Americans are more likely to believe that things in life like success arrive to people who have talent, who have hard work, who play by the rules. According to sociologist Peter Gallero, 73% of Americans say hard work is an important value. And most of this all stems from the kind of historical and current culture of individualism, which again is what we're examining a little bit in our one of our larger case studies. So it's this belief in self-reliance, excuse me, self-determination, this idea of America, the U.S. as a land of opportunity. More people today believe that movement between classes is possible. So going, from working class to middle class or middle class to upper class, for example. Although the evidence shows that it's actually becoming more difficult, has become more difficult over the past 40 years since the 80s. And some of that, perhaps, if we need an explanation for that, we can go back to previous understanding, examinations of the idea of globalization from the previous week 4. And that, growing gap is especially true if you look at, the opposite ends of that range of that economic spectrum in the hierarchy. So kind of our most important point here is that in a capitalist economy, which again, most of the world is a part of right now, social class is essentially about your location your individual location in the production process. So again, if you need to go back to the quick overview of in the week on infrastructure of our global society and infrastructure, you can go back to that if you're kind of a little confused here. And so this is kind of beginning by talking about the myth of meritocracy, that your individual talent or hard work will get you far in life and even help you rise in the production process. In fact, that's actually becoming harder and it's more complicated than that. So sociological evidence clearly shows that the class position of your family or the people that raise you is kind of the best predictor of your own class position as adults. So again, that individualistic lens, seeing kind of people that are ignoring the social and group aspects of our reality, kind of attribute any climbing of the ladder or the economic hierarchy as, due to personal traits, like as we saw. So if someone is poor or working class, it's because they're, at the most crudest version of this, the most crass version of this mindset, people are poor because they're not as skillful or intelligent or hardworking. Versus, people are rich, people are in the upper class because they're superior skills and, they have superior traits and attributes. So most people wouldn't say something like this in such a sort of crude way, but people do in many ways. You might believe this in some sense. So, if you perhaps saw someone on the street who was houseless or asking for donations, you might have this kind of immediate reaction, and maybe it doesn't last long, maybe it does, right? As sort of judgment of, oh, what did this person do? It's probably their fault that they are, in the situation they're in. And vice versa. If you saw someone, perhaps a CEO, you met an executive of a business, you might admire their seeming superior skills, right? Their talents that got them there. So that's one way of thinking about how people are structured in society in this hierarchical situation. But we have to ask, like, why does family, life? Why does, despite this individualistic lens, why does the evidence show that your family is actually the best predictor, not your talents or personal traits, of your future class position? Well, if we want to answer that, we got to kind of, again, step away from this myth of individualism, and see that family and social class are important parts of the larger social structure. And here we have a well-known family for anyone older than 15 years old. Differences in family structure or lifestyle don't define the class, define someone's social class. It's kind of defined instead by the differences in power that originate, again, in someone's position in the economy, their position, their location in the production process. So we could define social class, the focus here, as a discrete group socially segregated from other groups that has a common social history and predictable future. Um, you know, so thinking about, as we said, this kind of traditional classes of the working class or the poor, the middle class, the upper class, or upper middle class, etc. They're discrete groups that are kind of segregated from each other. Um, and in fact, if you think about competition, this idea of the ladder, as we sang, this image of uh, society as a hierarchical ladder where people are competing um, to kind of climb to the top, to rise to higher classes. Um, it's actually not a reflection of what's actually going on. The real competition is not between classes, or excuse me, it is between classes, not between individuals who are, trying to vie for a higher position. It's actually the classes themselves. There's an inherent competition. So, for example, broadly in capitalist economy, the success of the wealthy, of the rich, or rich families often occurs at the expense of people, in lower classes, the working class. So any, successful, any business owner might obviously has to know or understands in some obvious way that their profit, the surplus that they get to keep, um, can be increased by paying workers less, or providing less benefits to workers, so that there is this kind of inverse relationship and competition there. So if you can think about any sort of Fortune 500 or Dow corporation that a corporation that goes public on the Dow, for example, and now begins to have to answer to investors. Um, one kind of strategy investors or board of trustees have for increasing profit, annual profit or quarterly profit, would be to perhaps lay off surplus or extra workers, unneeded workers. You immediately will have what was once wages now become profit for the owners of the business. So in this scenario where one social class benefits from exploitation of another, there's also always a chance that that exploited class will revolt and demand greater justice. So here, I've provided pictures of UAW, of labor unions, um, which are a key piece of that process. If the ruling class successfully is entrenched in power, or kind of has a solid hold on the structure of uh, in that society of their economy, you know, everything will be kind of this exploitation will be kind of seen as normal or natural or inevitable, and in some ways that's very common in our country, or in the United States. Um, there is, despite an immense inequality of incomes, and the majority of people uh, essentially not making an ideal amount of money to live, or a living wage to buy a house, or to pay rent, even to feed themselves, despite this situation where most people in the country are struggling, don't have a savings, for example, more than $1,000, etc. There isn't necessarily this kind of mass revolt um, every day. If you, in some sense, if you stood back and ask yourselves, like, how is this possible? How are people not kind of rioting in the streets daily at this, whether it's at the issue of wages not having been increased since the 1970s, etc. It's kind of perhaps could be explained by, the ruling class has successfully taken power. People see it as normal. It's become we've become desensitized to this structure. But if the majority of people, this oppressed class, did not accept that as normal, they might agitate for change and force the ruling class to defend its position of domination or to justify it itself. So it's really interesting to think, always trying to think about how does our society function and could it be other ways, and how do we understand the strange aspects of our culture? Why are people not, for example, uh, working class or middle class people kind of losing it or revolting? So it's important to recognize overall, right, that we live in a society structured by class, and that the dominant class continues to justify and legitimate its position of authority with cultural beliefs. They've sort of convinced us over generations um, that this is our culture, and again, through the lens or through the vocabulary of individualism, right? There's this false sense of if we work hard and have talent, etc., we can be ruling class or upper class, can make it, um, and it masks the actual structure, right, of what's going on. Uh, Another important point, I think, is that without historical perspective, it's hard to see. It's hard to see the system or to recognize the inequality in our lives. So, for example, thinking about the United States, without that historical perspective, we wouldn't be able to see or verbalize that this is a colonial country, right? That it only exists because of the sort of colonization of this land, of Native American land, and the enslavement of African peoples over the course of hundreds of years. And none of that ever kind of ended. I mean, sort of ever was acknowledged um, as being foundational. It's kind of, again, covered over by this myth of sort of the greatness of America, American individualism. So, fundamentally, another example, having a historical perspective allows us to see how this situation leads to capitalism and how capitalism is kind of the main source of inequality. So, if we're, perhaps, as political citizens, trying to find a way to, a source of this issue, I would argue it can be found there. So that's one part of it, So how does the class system work? What is social class? Another aspect of this, of understanding class inequality and how it's reproduced or how it's legitimated, you have to sort of differentiate what we're talking about. So what is, here we use the term capital to do that. So there's economic capital, which again is more of the material kind of accumulated profit or resources that have been invested and traded, and you have to sort of be relatively rich already to have true economic capital. Most Americans have none or have very little, right? A lot of it for most people is tied up in home ownership, any other sort of assets in that sense. But not, a solid percentage of the United States does not own a home. So in 2021, for example, a few years ago, the top 10% of households in the US owned 71% of all wealth in the economy. And the bottom 50%, the majority of the country, really only accounted for 1% of the nation's wealth. So again, just let those numbers sink in. Again, looking at our own country as an example, and perhaps as the most intense example in the world of this inequality, again, being the kind of current and historically richest country to ever exist. What does that actually mean? who actually owns that wealth. So that's economic capital versus cultural capital. So as we're thinking about, how we structure our societies, cultural capital has incredible influence on our society structure. So that here we're defining that as kind of the range of different skills and habits, preferences, types of knowledge, and lifestyles that are associated with a certain class. So you can think of, each class having its own cultural capital, its own kind of way of life, skills, etc. Um, and those, because it's hierarchical, those different cultural capital has different value, right? So perhaps the rest of these slides kind of argue that the cultural capital of the upper class is kind of seen as the most desired. So there's a lot of pressure in so many aspects of our social system to live in a way that mimics the upper class. So, for example, educational credentials, right? So many of us that are going through school system and higher education deal with this situation. The prestige of schools you attend, the types of academic skills you learn in schools, that's one aspect of cultural capital that can give you value or more or less value. You went to an Ivy League, etc., versus a state school or community college, as we are here. Um, there's also so many other embodied qualities through your family or through socialization in each class. So, thinking about the way you speak, your vocabulary, your accent, how you walk, how you hold your body. Um, so, if you're from San Antonio, you can think of San Antonio as an example. I mean, I put a picture from the Dominion, which is on the northwest side, and kind of the wealthiest part of town, the suburbs, um, if you want to call it that, but I would say it's a class above that. Um, People who live in this part of town might be socialized, might act differently than other parts of town. And certain people might value their ways of being more than, for example, I'm from the west side, from the barrio or something. Um, those differences affect our confidence in general, right? When you're interacting between classes, if you, in the rare occasions that you might be doing that. So the clothes we wear, the food we eat, this is a real magazine from the Dominion neighborhood that I just showed you, etc. These, and often, as we say, these differences are misinterpreted, I would argue, as natural, preferences or your personality types. I like to wear these kinds of clothes. While in reality, these qualities are learned at an early age, right? You're socialized from your family, other neighbors, people that you see on a regular basis within your class. Um, because we're so socially segregated, so much of how we act and think and what we desire materially comes from your socialization in your class. And unlike economic capital, cultural capital is something that everyone has. So we all have skills, certain habits and ways of being, forms of knowledge, um, depending on our class position. It's not something that one person can have over another. Again, the issue is when in this hierarchical society, one class's cultural capital is valued more than others. So again, I kind of put some photos down the street from my grandparents' house in the west side. So everyone in these communities, and essentially the projects, to be crude, still have their own tastes and skills and accents and habits, but are maybe valued less than others in our own city. So another example and a way to think of this is education, schools, right? So teachers and administrators value or prefer certain, essentially upper class cultural capital. You can see this. You can see it in the curriculum, reflected in standards for assessing or informally assessing even, a children's kind of worth in the classroom or success in the classroom. And that's important because a teacher's expectations, research shows, influence the success a student might have. It really is this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. If your teacher at any level, K through 20, right, K through higher ed, see you as, again, perhaps conforming or performing in a certain way. Perhaps your interaction styles are confident, for example, right? You have a stronger vocabulary, excuse me. Your clothing is more upkept, um, or more upper class. It can lead to teachers expecting you to succeed. They assume, uh, you know, by the way you act and look and behave, because it's so similar to what is seen as successful, that you'll probably be successful, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and vice versa, right? If a teacher sort of has certain opinions, subconscious, uh, has been socialized to think, oh, you know, baggy pants, for example, equals sort of lazier person or a less serious uh, student or academic performer. That's not inherently, doesn't have to inherently be the case, right? But because we've been socialized to prefer a certain way of being, uh, students' whole lives can be, changed based on a teacher assuming or determining by the way you act and look and speak. Perhaps you speak, Spanish as your first language, or Tex-Mex, right? Perhaps you speak in mostly, slang. You might be seen as not as smart or not as capable. And that in that way, schools are gatekeepers of this system. They're one of the most important ways to control access between, pathways between classes. Um, and we can really find at the very end here, how do we understand where cultural capital come from? Why is it that certain, the middle class acts differently than other, the working or the upper class? For example, um, in many ways, these values of particular skill or attribute are dependent on the rules of the game, right? This is the way the society functions. Why do we value certain ones over others? It's not an easy answer, but it seems as if, according to humanities research and social science research, that it's closely associated with your job, with one's job, and what does it mean to be successful at the kind of job you have in this hierarchical system. So for example, and again, this is, speaking broadly, there are always kind of exceptions, but generally those exceptions don't negate the system. Working class jobs, for example, tend to be highly repetitive, less complex, and heavily supervised, right? So whether you're a cashier, a janitor, someone who works a factory line, a landscaper, for example, um, you know, your success in your job is seen as, do you follow orders, for example? Can you perform this repeated function, uh, these tasks, etc.? That's how your success in your job works. And perhaps, social scientists argue, uh, that influences how you in your life, how you live your life, right? What you might value or not. And again, knowing that from the previous video, we can resist this, right? So it's not one to one. It's not automatic that just because you have a highly repetitive or supervised uh, job that you will act or prefer that in your own life. But broadly speaking, versus middle or upper class jobs, if you have a sort of professional job or work in the knowledge economy, perhaps you're a product designer, right, or a lawyer or a doctor, your job involves more complex tasks where you have more free reign, not as heavily supervised, maybe. You requires creative problem solving. So the primary value is in being able to be independent, have some initiative, etc. And oftentimes that is reflected in the way you live your life, perhaps. So again, just kind of repeating that. So, success in one is about obedience, conformity, um, versus upper class might be success might mean being creative, being able to assert be argumentative for your points, your your project, etc. And so the idea is generally that that might affect how you parent, how you might pass those values on to your children and on and on and on, and in a sense that again by the accumulation of time, it is your family that is the best predictor of your class position. So one example, I try to think of this a lot off the top of my head for my own self, as an educator who is from a working class background, that I would, culturally call sort of old school Tejano, which is not in any way a scientific kind of term or anything. But in my family, for example, what mattered in an old school Tejano family where everyone worked as either a janitor or a farm worker, a landscaper, an automotive worker, mechanic, that sort of thing. What mattered is, in the job was following your boss's orders, doing what you're told, and in many ways, that's how I was raised. Your parents are the boss. There's not a lot of free will that the children are allowed. You can't do whatever you want. You have to, contribute, for example, chores and, that sort of thing to the good of the family. You can't just kind of sit around and watch TV all day. And again, this was back in decades past, and things are different now. There were not smartphones or the internet and that sort of thing. But on a very broad level, that was what was important. Versus now that I have done what we're all aspiring to do, perhaps to climb that ladder. I've seen that families raised in a different way from Mexicano, Tejano, strict families, which is again just one group. Where perhaps the children of upper class people that I've met are allowed more freedom. They can choose to do what they want with their time. So it's really interesting. I think again, none of this is automatic. Not everything is like this. There are always exceptions, and as cultures change, the structure of this might change as well. Um, so that it's more complex. It's harder to define it in this way. Again, thinking about the new kinds of technologies, also thinking about the way the environment is changing, the way sort of cities are growing. Excuse me. So children act in a different way than they did in the past, and parents are forced to rethink how they parent. So again, none of this is automatically or always true. But the overall point, right, is that your class position as a child is inherited from your parents. So we talked about what is social class, and we've talked about um, the fact that it's inherited from your family and where it comes from, right? So into adulthood, different values might be associated with different forms of cultural capital. Um, and that cultural capital, what's valued most, often influences economic capital. So it reproduces the system of our society. So, at the end of the day, to end here, the dominant cultural beliefs falsely celebrate merit and individual choice. So we see people's position in society as due to their choice and their actions. And while that is often true, it is not the whole story. In fact, I would argue this is a problematic way of seeing things, when actually the system is built on the unequal distribution of resources in an unjust way. So again, this influences this kind of reality we're talking about can be applied to so many aspects of our society. Thinking here, we have Trinity University, so thinking about which schools are, seen as better schools, which jobs are seen as better jobs, and neighborhoods and foods and ways of sort of entertainment and recreation, etc. So, this is the challenge to see how you see this in the world, to use this basic, perhaps, fact of social class as a lens. How do you see this play out in the world around you? So I'll stop there.